Well, hello, ladies. Here is your recap for our Bible study last night. If you are just stopping by and visiting our page, my name is Michelle Snyder, facilitator of the study that we're doing through the book of Philippians. Last night we did the second half of Philippians chapter 2 from verses 14 all the way to 30. So I'm going to give you a quick summary of what we talked about. And the very first verse we came to was verse 14, where it says, do all things without complaining and disputing. Oh my goodness, that caught our attention right off the bat. That you may become blameless and harmless children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. And there was a lot of confessing going on and just sharing a little bit about how we all have the tendency to grumble and complain. Paul, in this passage here, he specifically used terms that were just to describe Israel's complaining, because when we look back at the Israelites in the Exodus, that's all they did, complain, 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 and we're no different. Spurgeon himself said, those are first the providence of God. We should not complain against the providence of God. That's what the Israelites did, and that's what we find ourselves doing a lot. Never, ever, ever complain about the acts that God allows to happen. It's funny, there's a little reflection. I don't know where that's coming from. My husband is in Costco getting his eyes checked, so this would be a good time for me to come and do the summary. The second one that Spurgeon talks about is complaining against one another. We are so guilty of that. And I don't know, was it Spurgeon? Yes, it was Spurgeon that told the story of Calvin and Luther. Calvin had heard that Luther had spoken ill of him. And we don't like hearing that people have been talking smack about us, do we? And so I read this with such great interest, like, what's Calvin going to say? And this is what he said. He said, let Luther call me the devil, if he please. I will say of him that he is a most dear and valiant servant of the Lord. What a comeback. I was so impressed by that. Through the display of a non-complaining spirit, we can show ourselves to be true followers of God. Now, what happens if we're in a situation where sin is exposed or evil is exposed? You know, Jesus says to turn the other cheek, but we should not turn the other cheek when it comes to addressing something that is truly, truly wrong. Those hard issues have to be dealt with. But for the most part, I'm just talking about snippy little situations in relationships within churches that can happen between God's children. And I just thought that story of Calvin and Luther was really good. And then he goes on and he admonishes us to shine as lights in the world. Wow, that's a high calling. And it begs the question, how brightly do we have to shine? I saw an ad about a t-shirt the other day that said, be salty, because we're called to be salt and light. And this t-shirt said, be salty, stay lit. You know, the enemy is out there and he wants to snuff out that little bit of light that we might have. He is always looking for opportunities to do that. Check it out in Matthew 5:13 and 14. We are to be the light, and it's not our own light. It is a reflection of the light of Christ, just as the moon is a reflection of the sun. So then in Philippians 2, verses 17 through 18, Paul says, yes, and I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith. I am glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice with me. Paul was looking forward to what might be his imminent return to the Philippians, or it might be his imminent martyrdom. And either way, he wanted to rejoice, and he wanted the Philippians to rejoice. He wasn't being morbid here. He was asking the Philippians to take joy in something as depressing as his death. You know, it seems like an oxymoron, doesn't it? We never take joy in death. But what it boils down to here is that Paul's life was going to be a sacrifice for Jesus Christ, either in life or death. And that was a source of gladness and joy for Paul. And he wants the Philippians to adopt that same kind of attitude. And again, we come to a consistent theme here in the book of Philippians that pops up over and over again. And it is that joy should not be based on our circumstances. It's actually quite the opposite. Joy should actually be based on the fact of a life totally committed to Jesus Christ, come what may. And one thing that we don't do a lot here in the summary is to read a lot of the cross references. But of course, we can't talk about sacrifice without going into Romans 12, verse 1, where Paul says, I appeal to you, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And then he goes on and he tells us not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind, which is the will of God, and what is good and acceptable and perfect. And then Numbers 28, verse 7, where it talks about the sacrifice. That is to read about the Jewish system of sacrifice. And the Gentiles had a whole different view of the drink offering because it had been wine poured out to pagan deities. They didn't understand at all the Jewish concept of sacrifice. But nevertheless, when you're totally committed to serving Christ, Jew or Gentile, sacrificing to build the faith of others should bring a joyous reward, and it truly does. And then, of course, in our discussion, we talked about the different ways that we can, first of all, be lights in the world. How are we different? We talked about how we're peculiar people, and there are a lot of different stories told about, a time when we would have had a different reaction. But because the Lord lives in us, we were able to handle it in a much better way, a peculiar way, one that others would look at and say, wow, how did they do that? Or how I could never do that. It's called being peculiar because we are peculiar people. And so then about the sacrifice too, the being poured out as a sacrifice, as an offering unto the Lord. How do we do that? Well, we give up our self-interest, number one, and God is always placing those opportunities before us. Going on and reading Philippians 2, 19 through 22, Paul writes about Timothy's soon anticipated visit. And he says, but I trust in the Lord Jesus Christ to send Timothy to you shortly, that I also may be encouraged when I know your state. For I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state. And listen, this is what he says about Timothy. For all seek their own, not the things which are Christ Jesus. But you know his proven character, that as a son with his father, he served with me in the gospel. He was affirming Timothy's Christ-likeness and wanting the Philippians to receive him and be comfortable with him, because Timothy did not seek his own interests. He looked for the interests of others, and Paul was confident that he would do that. Then in verse 23, Paul says, therefore I hope to send him at once as soon as I see how it goes with me. But I trust in the Lord that I myself shall also come shortly. He is believing that he's going to get out, even though he doesn't know if he might be executed still. So he was waiting for his trial there in Rome, not sure what the verdict would be. And Epaphroditus was another one that ranked right up there in Paul's eyes as someone to be trusted who truly cared about the Philippians. And that was Epaphroditus. He says, yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, my fellow worker, and fellow soldier, but your messenger and the one who ministered to my need, since he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. So this undoubtedly meant that Epaphroditus, am I saying that right? He took this letter to the Philippians. That was before the days of Pony Express. So it seems that Epaphroditus came to Paul from Philippi as a messenger, and he became sick while he was there. But he was very, very useful to Paul, and he had the greatest respect for this man. So my husband called, and then my battery ran out on my phone, and now I'm back, and we're still in the Costco parking lot. To pick up where I left off, it seems that Epaphroditus came to Paul from Philippi as a mere messenger, and that was it. And then he became very, very sick while he was there. In fact, he almost died. Paul apparently had the highest respect for Epaphroditus. Again, he referred to him here in these verses as his brother, his fellow worker, and a fellow soldier. And a brother speaks of a close relationship to be enjoyed. Worker speaks of a job well done. And a soldier speaks of a battle that needs to be fought. And that's what he thought of Epaphroditus. And so in Philippians 2:27, he says, "For indeed he was sick almost unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow." So Paul is facing this bleak future for himself if he is executed, and then on top of that, he would have lost his brother Epaphroditus. So God's mercy to Epaphroditus was also his mercy to Paul himself. So yes, Epaphroditus did recover and was able to go on. In verses 28 and 30, the last two verses we covered, it says, "Therefore I sent him the more eagerly, that when you see him again you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem, because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me." A messenger, and he became sick serving the Lord. Talk about selflessness. That was Epaphroditus. And the part I love about this story the most is that even though his work was mostly that of being a messenger and not anything particularly spiritual, it was still the work of Christ. And that made me think of my dear friend Tammy Zimmerman. Some of you who are watching locally will know who I'm talking about. A beautiful servant of the Lord, a beautiful sister, a beautiful worker, and a beautiful soldier in this battle. And I was looking for her in a room where everyone was just praising the Lord. Their hands were lifted high. The music was beautiful. And I'm looking around for Tammy, couldn't find her anywhere, and I looked off to my left, and I saw some movement on the floor in an adjoining room. So I headed that direction, and what did I find? But Tammy was on her knees scrubbing a toilet. And I kid you not, I stood there and cried like a baby. I watched her for a long time before she even knew I was there. To see her serving the Lord in such a beautiful way, and the Lord stopped me and he spoke to me there in his still, quiet voice as only he can. And he said, "This is worship." And I always think of Tammy when I read this about Epaphroditus. She wasn't up there on stage, singing or preaching or anything like that, but she was worshiping every bit as much as if she were up there doing those things. And I'm touched by Epaphroditus and his willingness to put the work of Christ first and foremost before his personal safety. That so well displays the noble heart of this man. I don't know about you, but I want to be like him. We should all have that heart, that there's something lacking in our service until the job is done. God is not finished with us yet, as he says in Philippians 1:6, that he is faithful to complete that which he has begun. He will not stop working in and through us as long as we have breath, and we should not be satisfied with good intentions or a half-baked job. So after Epaphroditus recovered, he returned home, and he is mentioned only in Philippians 2:29 and 30. This man was a man of integrity and honor. The world, speaking of honor, it honors those who are intelligent, beautiful, rich, and powerful, but God works by a different set of standards. So what kind of people should the church honor? That's a really good question for us to ask ourselves. Paul indicates that we should honor those who give their lives for the sake of Christ, going where we ourselves cannot go. Missionaries do that kind of work for the Lord, and we should do all we can to support them financially, with prayer, with encouragement. There's so many out there in questionable circumstances, and yet they're serving with their hearts, and they're serving unto death if that's what it requires. That is the kind of believer in Jesus that I want to be. And so, yeah, as long as we're here, God's going to use us. He gives us opportunities every day. All we need to do is open our eyes and look around. And I'm going to go back into Costco right now and see what he has for me in there. So that was a summary, brief summary of what we talked about. If you couldn't be here, I hope this fills you in a little bit, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Otherwise, if you're listening online, we will be back to provide another summary for next week. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his countenance shine upon you and give you peace. God bless you all. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.